Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Just this past year, we had an all-female crew win the skipjack race off of Deal Island. But long before that, there was the woman in the wheelhouse. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Nancy Taylor Robson was that woman, and that is the title of her book about her 6-year odyssey as a relief cook and deckhand on a tugboat, traveling from New Orleans and Maine to Bermuda and Mexico, as well as, of course, here in the Chesapeake Bay. She was also the first woman to hold a U.S. Coast Guard license to run coastal tugboats, and all of this occurring in the mid-1970s. And we have her in the studio. Welcome to the program, first of all.
Thank you so much.
Well, let me ask you, how did you get dragged into this? Because I guess your husband was involved with this.
Yes, I met this cute little man. I want to make one correction, though. I was not the first woman. I was one of the first women.
Okay.
One of the early women, yeah.
But yeah, so how did you get involved with this?
Well, my husband graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy, and that gives you a license to run tugboats. And his roommate was, one of his friends there was the son of a guy who had grown up on tugs and who had a tug. It was just bought a new tug, or actually an old tug.
Right.
And needed to have a mate. He had to crew it. So Gary ended up right out of college, practically, on this tug. And then when he and I started dating, he was still building sails, and he said, I'd like to own a tugboat, and I'd like you to come and do it with me. And I thought, okay. I grew up sailing, so I thought, okay, I could do that.
It's a bit different than just sailing.
Much different. And the interesting thing to me was that, by the time I had actually gone on the tug at all, I sort of thought, oh, I'm not sure. It's, it's metal, it's rusty, it's hard work, it's dirty, and heavy stuff. And everybody I mentioned to was like, that is so cool. And my mother, who was anything but an old salt, said, I always thought I wanted to live on a tugboat. And I'm thinking, tied up where? Because I couldn't imagine her, she was not that keen on sailing, let alone being on a tug, I didn't think.
So what is it? So what were your kinds of duties, and what was that experience like in terms of its physicality?
It's a very physical job on the tug that I was on. I think actually any job in commercial maritime is a very, very physical job because most of the equipment is heavy, and it's only getting heavier. This boat was 85 feet long. She was built in 1942, a DPC, and she was designed to run across the ocean during the war. So she carried lots of fuel and not an awful lot of water, so you had to take Navy showers. The lash straps, we had straps that were made out of really thick hawser that were relatively short. I can't remember. They might have been 8-10 feet long. Then they had big metal bridles swedged into them with big heavy thimbles, so they weighed about 85 pounds apiece. And we had to fling, doubles of those, maybe 14, 20, something like that, over the upper deck, across a gap onto a barge when we were making up lash tows. The hawser work, pulling the hawser, jumping from one barge to another when the boat is leaping around in bad weather, when lash tows broke apart and you had to get out there and figure out how to, make the jump without losing a limb. It's incredibly physical work. And of course, if there's on this boat, some boats you can get everywhere inside. On this boat, any place you went from one stateroom or the galley or the wheelhouse to any place else, it was outside. So if it was icy and blowing and the water was coming green over top of everything, you were going to get it too.
So, you're a woman who sort of got introduced to this male environment. In terms of physicality, because you were not only the cook, but you also operate as a deckhand.
Yes.
How did you relate to the other men in terms of just this physical necessity of dealing with this very harsh environment?
Well, I have lived a physical life. I'm tall. I'm 5'8", and I've always done physical work. I built boats with my dad, and so I've always sailed and raced, and I always thought of it as being, you need to be strong, you need to be physical in your life. This was it was a real eye-opener, though, I have to say, because just, the difference between hauling up a halyard on a 35-foot sailboat and hauling around a hawser that's got a 6-inch circumference are two very, very different things.
A hawser, what is that?
The hawser is the line that attaches the back end of the tug to the barge. Actually, it goes from, in this one, some of them are all wire. On this one, it was line. And it attaches to the back of the tug, to the stern of the tug on a pair of H-bits, and then goes to a metal bridle that's fairly long that you drop over top of the forward bits on the barge to pull it.
So how were you received by men in this profession?
It varied.
So I gathered, yeah.
Yeah, some were open to it. Some were pretended they weren't hostile and yet were. One guy... once I got my license, at one point I was asked, I sort of ran as a freelance mate for various tug companies, and I got on as a mate to this one tug that was coming down from Wilmington through the C&D Canal, and the guy who was the captain pretended that he was okay with it, but he wasn't at all, and he came up with a cup of coffee when I was on watch and I was taking it through the canal, and just leaned, sort of pretended he was leaning out the window and was chatting away. And I'm suddenly heading into the side of the canal, and I'm playing with everything I can play with, the helm and whatnot, and I can't get the thing to answer. And I'm watching the thing, and I'm watching the indicator for the rudder go over to be pushing us into the rocks. And it finally dawned on me that he had it. He had it, and I got hold of him. I said, "You're leaning on me," and I got him by the shirt and pulled him away from it. And I thought about it, and so he went down. He realized I caught him at it, but he was trying to make it so that I had an accident on my watch. And he went back down into the galley and was making, oh, Nancy, went crazy, and she thought I was doing this and all this kind of thing. And then somebody else came up later and said, "Oh, that didn't sound like you." I said, "No, here's what happened." And some people believed me and some people didn't, or some people didn't want to. But a good portion of the time when I was on board with sort of a regular crew and people who I knew, they knew I was there to do the job. They knew even if I was not on the same boat, I was married all the time to the same person. And I think that did help. I think the fact that Gary was known around the water, that helped too.
One of the things you write, and I'll sort of read this a little here, talking about men and about this lifestyle, and you just say, perhaps the worst of it for them, being men, was the exposure of frailties that this living situation entails. The work is physically demanding, and it requires a certain amount of pure bravado to endure. Exhaustion and heat stretch nerves, and facades grow thin, allowing glimpses into the soul of unguarded moments. I had begun to feel as though it was this exposure that men feared most. They live two wholly separate experiences and find incorporating one into the other a constantly fraying experience. They leave family, friends, and comfort ashore to step into another dimension, an existence whose boundaries are the confine of the tug and whose isolation is complete from all but the reality of day-to-day running. I mean, does that sum up this kind of fear that they had, certainly when you were around, but also a certain isolation in this entire world that they're operating in?
Absolutely. I think it's very tough. It's very hard on relationships ashore. There are very few people that I met out there when I was working that were married to the people they started with, and were very aware of how hard it was. And the other interesting thing to me was that a lot of times somebody would come into the galley, though. Somehow the galley was a different space. And they could come into the galley and sit down with a cup of coffee, and they might actually open up a little bit. But when you were out on deck doing this, working side by side, doing the same work, you had to pretend you hadn't heard any of that.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Was it when they were around you? Were they more guarded, do you think, with their own emotions and with their own feelings, as opposed to, say, other men, or was it? Do you think it's just a sort of a shield that they? I mean, because I think you indicated there's a certain vibrato that.
It's such a physical job, and it's a job that a lot of these guys get into. I say guys because it's primarily men, but not all men now.
Right.
I think they get into it because it's a well-paid job relative to what they could have had on shore with the education a lot of them had. It's not necessarily true these days. It has changed. but they didn't want to lose that job. So any frailty, any indication that maybe the years were taking the toll was something that to be, you couldn't let anybody know that.
Just for your own future employment.
For your own future employment. And interestingly, there were more men out there as they got older who dyed their hair than any women I'd ever seen.
So what happens to people as they age? I mean, because I know, for instance, I see a lot of the watermen here, and a number of them are really old. I mean, they're older. I mean, they're like in their 60s or their 70s. I mean, which is getting up there in terms of the physicality of the job. Did you find that to be the case? Were there a lot of older folks, or was it more younger?
It ages you.
Yeah.
It ages you really quickly. And I think that, and between that and sort of the diesel smoke and the chemistry that you deal with, that ages you. It's very hard on a human body. And just the wear and tear of being constantly amongst other people. I mean, if you get along with your crew, fine. If you think that everybody's got your back, that's a different atmosphere because you have to have sort of a collegial, cooperative. It isn't always the case. I know Clarkie, one fellow that had run on boats all his life. At one point, I was on board, and I was afraid of a fellow who was, at that point, decking. And I said something to him quietly about it because I figured, there's no point in saying it to anybody else. And I said, what do you think? He said, if you have that feeling, trust it. And he stayed, and he would stay with me. And there was another time when we were working barges in Norfolk, and he heard that there was a guy that had been scooped out of one state and put to work on another tug that we were working alongside because he was indicted for murder. And he said, no, you stay right with me. You and I are going to work side by side. We're not going to be at either site this whole evening because it was nighttime. We were working, late shift.
Now, one of the things that you describe is going, I guess, up the coast, but you talk about doing this in the winter. As a matter of fact, there's a photograph I think you have of one of the stairways or whatever, and it's just like it looks like it's not only stacked with ice, but with snow and that kind of. I mean, tell me a little bit about that experience, and because it seems like most of us when we think about going out on the water, we think about, well, okay, it's not icy or you don't go out exactly. Tell me a little bit about that experience. I mean.
The picture you're describing and the one that I'm looking at the moment is the only time I really thought I was going to die on a boat. We had gone down to pick up a barge that was coming up. Another tug was bringing it up from Puerto Rico loaded with sugar. And it was a big barge. It was a great big one for us, particularly because it was only 750 horsepower was the Progress. We got the thing in a storm. It was about 70 knot north blow in February, and we picked it up from them. They had towed it up from Puerto Rico off of Cape Henry at the bottom of the bay, went down there to try and trade lines, and that in itself was a real struggle. And then when we finally hooked up to the barge and they bolted for home, we started towing it up the bay toward Baltimore, toward the Domino sugar plant, and as the spray hits the house in cold weather, it ices up, which is what you're looking at in the picture. I mean, it iced up the forward ladder to get to the wheelhouse to the point where you could not get up the ice at all. You couldn't get up the ladder at all. And we spent as it builds more ice on the house, on the tug house, it changes the rolling moment, which means if it rolls over a little farther, it may not come back. And at one point, as I was waiting for the thing, you could wait and it would sort of hang. And you're thinking, okay, it is coming back up, but it was taking the longest time, and then it would come back again, and then it would go back down again. And so, is that farther? Is that farther? Am I ever going to, I really did think I was not going to see the light of day, and I started thinking about, I wonder what it feels like to die. I wonder how fast it would be in this cold weather. I don't know. There are worse ways, So, that part was, but we ducked into, fortunately, we were close enough, and Gary ducked into the Rappahannock, and we spent 2 days literally beating the ice off of everything we had with big pieces of pipe.
So you have something else to read here, I think.
I do.
Yes.
I was going to just read you just the piece of when we went down. We met Little Dan, this tug that was bringing this tow up from Puerto Rico, And by the time we reached the Little Dan and tow off Cape Henry, the seas had become steadily rising with the winds. It was almost too rough to make the transfer. The barge had permanent bridles to which the Little Dan had attached a 400-foot piece of nylon line. When we were about 45 minutes away, they began to take in their main hawser, the tow line, stopping the 400-foot piece off in order to unshackle their hawser and attach ours. The tugs were jumping wildly in a nasty chop, and all hands on both tugs were turned out to help in the transfer. Doug, who was the mate, lassoed the Little Dan's quarter bits. Then he and the deckhand on Little Dan doubled the line, cinching the two tugs together. It was too rough to hold. The vessels crashed up and down against one another like two unbroken stallions, clawing for freedom in a deafening crunching of metal and tires. "We can't do this," Gary shouted from the wheelhouse window. "Doug, let him loose. We have to hold on station." Doug and the other man fought the line free, and the two captains shifted the tugs apart a few feet, trying to hold them in place while the rest of the crew worked. Harry, the deckhand, and I were on the fantail, unshackling our bridles from the hawser thimble in preparation for handing the end of the hawser over the gap to be attached to the 400-foot section of intermediate hawser. "Get a line in the thimble, and we'll take that across," called one of the deckhands on the Little Dan. I tied a deck line into the hawser's eye and made ready to heave the deck line across. The tug jounced unpredictably. "We can't get the shackle into the damn thimble. She's too small. You got a shackle?" another of the men cried over the din after they had tried unsuccessfully to wedge their heavy shackle through the eye in our smaller hawser. Harry and I scrambled to the milk crate full of shackles, pawing through them with our rumps braced against the towing bits. "I've got one here. Look out, the stopper line's slipping," one of the men yelled. The line that had held the intermediate hawser against their towing bits, a makeshift rig to enable the men to unshackle their hawser and shackle ours, had begun to give way. With the thrashing of the gear, a sudden escape could be fatal for whoever was close by. "We've got a shackle that'll fit. Get it in there." 3 men pounced on the lines. "Come on, you son of a bitch. Get in there." "Look out, she's coming free. Get that pin in there. Give me a hammer." "No, it's coming. Look out. I got it. Here, get it wired." "Okay." One of the men stood back and released the slipping stopper line. The others ducked out of the way. The transfer was made. Our hawser replaced theirs, and they were free to slide out from under the gear and run for cover. Once the hawser had dropped clear of the propellers, we let out more scope in order to cope with the rising weather conditions.
So, a harrowing experience.
Yeah, scary, because you know that at any moment, if something pops, you could lose a person.
Now, you also went down to Mexico and to Bermuda. What was that like? Obviously, we've talked a lot about the winter. What was it like to go down south?
Well, the ride to Bermuda was a very sudden change. We were home, actually. We had just come back from delivering a sailboat, and I was making pickle, and Gary got a phone call, and the guy who owned the tug said, "What would it take to be able to run to Bermuda?" And he sort of laughed because he thought maybe, he was kidding. No, we've got a tow to go out to Bermuda. And Gary said, "Well, here's what it'll take." He said, yes, fine. "Can you be to Norfolk in 5 hours?" He said, "It takes us 5 hours to drive to Norfolk." "No, we have things we have to do. We'll be there in 8. He said, and apparently Curl, who at the time was the permanent cook on board, refused to go because he was afraid. Turns out the barge that was going out to the Navy, which is what we were going to take, the first people that were supposed to take it, the boat had sunk. They hired somebody else. The boat had sunk. And Curl thought this was not a good omen. So in the end, we didn't know that part initially, but we ended up down in Norfolk. We had extra people on board because you have to, once you're 600 miles offshore, you have to have more watches. And we left Norfolk and straight on out there, really pretty weather, really nice. And it's wonderful running offshore in really nice weather because the wildlife is fantastic. The porpoises come to find you because they like to play. They like to show off. There was one in particular that, as we all sort of stood up there and shouted and clapped for him, he did more and more and more stunts. It was like being at SeaWorld, but with a great big open place. At one point at night, it was dark. Gary, I was holding the wheel, and Gary was down below, and he get himself a cup of coffee, and I heard a shout, and I went running down below, and there's a flying fish that had come in the companionway door and hit him in the back, and landed on just startled him. I didn't know what it was. So we picked it up, and we threw it back overboard. But that was lovely. And then we got out to Bermuda to get in, and they wouldn't let us come into St. George's because it was just we couldn't get to the dock before dark. Okay, fine. So we stood out there and we just idled around overnight. And David, the mate, then had swum the length of the hawser out to the barge and back. And then when we got in, we discovered that was where all the sharks feed. However, he came back with everything intact.
Everything. Well, this is a good thing.
Yeah.
And then you also went to Mexico. I mean, which seemed almost like the Wild West.
It really was. It was like going to it was like going to sort of the gold rush or something, as far as I could tell. We got down there. I was the only woman that was working on the boats that I could find, that I really found. And I was really visible in the place because everybody else was sort of Mayan Indian, so they came up to about my chin. But I was so impressed with all of them. I mean, the water ran in the streets. The plumbing was appalling down there. At one point, we were chased away. We were chased out of the place at gunpoint, which sounds actually fairly dramatic, doesn't it, when you think about it?
Yes, that's right.
That was sort of toward the end, though. We worked there. We worked in the Campeche oil fields on a supply boat. And running around in that was... it was really quite something. The guy who was it was all the Mexicans on the shore. There was a port captain there who every time I'd get ashore, he would sort of come over and kind of squeeze my arm like ripe fruit, and it was very odd. And figuring out and I didn't speak a lot of Spanish. I spoke enough Spanish to get beer and get food and get back to the boat. Picking out a turkey for Thanksgiving involved going to the markets, and it was like a whole abattoir, blood everywhere. And there was one guy that was sitting in the shade with a bunch of live turkeys under a tree, just tethered to, by their necks. And he knew the Americans. That's what the deal was. So I went and was sort of feeling this bird, and this bird leaned down to rub his neck against my hand as I'm feeling his breast beat, and I'm thinking, oh, I'm not sure I can do this.
So you finally, one other thing I wanted to mention, which is, of course, your husband had a run-in with the Coast Guard, and there was sort of an interesting aftermath. Tell me a little bit about that. What happened there?
We were in Philadelphia. The tug was, we were fixing engines, so the radio was not on, there was no electricity on, nothing was going. And before we left to go to Baltimore, it was February. Very, very cold, icy, a lot of ice building up. And he had called the Coast Guard in Philadelphia. He called the C&D Canal, and he called the Coast Guard in Baltimore to find out if there were any travel restrictions, because a lot of times if the ice builds, they start putting horsepower restrictions. And we're fairly low horsepower at 750. So nobody, no, everything's fine. We cast off. We were heading south. We were just like tug. We were just by ourselves. And we got down to the C&D Canal, which looked like the Mixmaster had gone through. It was just filled with all this crenellated ice. Asked if they were convoying through. Nope. Can we come through? Yep. No problem. Is there anything on the other side? Nope. Went through the canal, got on the other side, and it was very, very icy. There was a long, it was really starting, you could have skated on the upper bay. And we were just part of going across Pools Island Flats to get into Baltimore. You were, it was like breaking ice. You were back up, a couple times had to back up and through. Got into Baltimore, fine. Where we were to go back out down to the Bay Bridge to meet a tug coming up with a barge. And we got part way out of there. It was a blizzard by that time, too, thank you. And couldn't get out. Gary called and said, we can't get out. And as we're just standing on station at Key Bridge, got this phone call, a radio call, and normally you identify yourself on the radio. Hello, this is, whoever you are. And it was just, Progress, where are you? And he told them, and he said, okay, where are you going? And he told them we were going to tie up at Fells Point. Okay. Got to Fells Point, and I came back. By the time I came back I'd called a friend in Baltimore and gone to go get groceries. By the time I got back, there were a couple of Coast Guard people there. And they had come to grab Gary, basically, and said, you've made an illegal passage. We had closed the whole place. And the new port captain had decided, we found out later, he wanted to prove that the Coast Guard had teeth.
And you were it.
And we were the ones that were going to get chewed. And so they wanted us to be, they tried to take the logbooks. We refused to let them. And we said, you're going to have to subpoena the logbooks, thanks. And then we ended up having to get a lawyer. Gary got a lawyer. I say we, because what they wanted was his license and $25,000, which meant he would have lost his livelihood, and we had to sell the house to pay the fine.
Now, you ultimately, of course, you won. You were able to win this, but then, ironically, one of it. Let's tell a little bit about it later on, just briefly.
The interesting thing is that the man who at the time was the one that wanted to make sure the Coast Guard had teeth turned out to be the father of, many years later, because we did not have children then, turned out to be the father of our son's college roommate. And when our daughter decided that she wanted to go to Kings Point Merchant Marine Academy, she had to have various recommendations. And by that time, the port captain had become the commandant of the entire Coast Guard. And so this young man's father came to the house, met our daughter, and then wrote a lovely letter of recommendation for her to go to Kings Point. And we sort of figured, well, the universe has spoken. Thank you.
We've been speaking with Nancy Taylor Robson. She has written a book called The Woman in the Wheelhouse about her experience in the 1970s as both the cook as well as a deckhand, and an interesting experience. And as I say, as I think I indicated before the show, a much more physically demanding and uncertain environment than I think any job I've ever even read about. So this has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush, and thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast in iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, visit the Daily Times or visit pac14.org.